The one point that I did notice in the bio about Jack is that he juxtapositions social justice themes against what I would call general assumptions or general kind of ways of thinking. So I think he has an interesting way of looking at things and challenging our mindsets. The other comment is that I was really disappointed when our primary process resulted in Jack losing, because I was left with what I was left with, and I had really some excitement here in Minnesota that good things are going to happen. Maybe the next round it will. But he's here. But he's here tonight to share his vision of a 21st century, and with that, Jack will be here to speak with you.
Well, before I start, just if anybody walks in late, they're not going to figure out what I'm doing. So with that background, I'm going to start. Historians don't agree on what or how the Great Transformation came about. They do agree on some things. And one thing they agree on, that the critical time period was the second decade of the 21st century. They also agree that during the first decade of the new century, the so-called lost decade of the neocons, the Bush administration had disgraced the country, completely misread history, and brought the nation to the brink of disaster. I'll come back to that in a minute. Most historians also agree that the Barack Obama administration got off to a really, really bad start. And not only because of the mess that it inherited. And there's also near consensus among credible historians that the crises that nearly destroyed the country were bipartisan affairs. That both Democrats and Republicans failed because they were guided by a deeply flawed vision that, among other things, ignored ecological realities and confused military power with real strength. Before describing what led to foreign policy changes that led to the Great Transformation, let me tell you about what preceded it, because it makes the story all the more compelling. For decades following World War II, the United States guided its foreign policy throughout the so-called Third World by seeking to protect economic interests by backing repressive dictatorships, authoritarian governments, and brutal military powers. George Kennan, the leading foreign policy planner for the United States in 1948, laid out exactly why this was the case. He noted that the United States had about 6% of the world's people at the time and half its wealth, and said that the purpose of U.S. foreign policy was to maintain that disparity. And that in order to do that, the United States would have to cease to even talk about unreal objectives like democracy or human rights or development. In the 1980s, U.S. foreign policy was guided by two tracks: a dramatic increase in the backing of repressive governments in Latin America, but also they learned that they could send in the bankers and take advantage of debt. This was the decade of the structural adjustment programs, imposed on poor countries who had to cut their spending for health care and education, had to open up their economies to foreign investment, had to make sure that they didn't have strict environmental standards. And the structural adjustment programs were as deadly as the repressive governments. Then, the election of Bill Clinton led to some changes, and those changes were largely related to the fact that the Soviet Union had collapsed. And now the idea was that you could take structural adjustment programs and you could institutionalize them. You could put them into free trade agreements. You could create an organization like the World Trade Organization that set the rules that all countries had to live by. And watch inequality grow, watch the environmental crisis deepen, watch the power that you had to make decisions over your own country slip away to powerful outside forces. Thomas Friedman was one of the key spokespeople for the idea that you didn't have to send in repressive governments or militaries all the time. You could exercise your influence through economic power. He talked openly in a world where half the world's people were living on less than $2 a day, how you could unite elites in the global economy. He wrote, once a country makes the leap into the system of globalization, its elites begin to internalize this perspective of integration and always try to locate themselves in a global context. He noted, quote, that the reason that the United States should support the United Nations and the IMF and the World Bank was that it allowed the U.S. to fulfill its goals without experiencing military casualties. He noted that the United States could dictate to the world through what he called the electronic herd and the golden straitjacket, the powerful economic forces that later on came to destroy the economy of the United States and send the world into an economic crisis at the end of the first decade of the 21st century. But even Friedman had to acknowledge that there was still that place for repression. He wrote, "The hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas, the designer of the U.S. Air Force's F-15. Friedman wrote, and the hidden fist that keeps the world safe for Silicon Valley's technologies to flourish is called the U.S. Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. And these fighting forces and institutions are paid for by American taxpayers." Well, this leads us to the Bush administration and the last decade of the neocons. Their policies you could see take shape way back in 1992 as before Clinton was elected president, when Cheney was then the Secretary of Defense, and his associate was Paul Wolfowitz. And in 1992, they wrote a document in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union called the Defense Policy Review. And what they concluded was this: the purpose of U.S. foreign policy, they said, should be to prevent ever in history again there being a country or group of countries able to rival U.S. power or challenge U.S. power. They said that now that the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore, there was no one to stop the United States that should aggressively use its military around the world to achieve that objective. And it called on the United States to pull out of all international agreements that limited the unilateral use of U.S. power. Well, then Clinton was elected. But the neocons didn't go away. They went into think tanks. And they made perhaps their most articulate statement of what led to the last decade in what they called America's Grand Strategy, which they released in September of 2000. And they noted that if the United States would take certain actions, it could turn present military superiority into permanent global domination.